Thanks, everybody, for joining us here today for this panel discussion. I'm Jeff Kelly. I work on the data team at Pivotal. Today, we are going to talk a little bit about developing data-intensive applications. We all know we live in this world of big and fast data, and these applications increasingly need to process a lot of data, get the right data to the right people at the right time. That has implications for the way you develop software, develop applications. So we've got a great panel today of people who have a lot of experience doing that and a lot of interesting opinions on some best practices and potentially some pitfalls to avoid. So we've only got 30 minutes for this panel, so we're going to quickly jump into it. I'll just do some quick introductions, starting on my far left. Langevin is joining us. He's a consultant at CIBC who spent the past 15 years providing technology solutions to a broad spectrum of risk management functions with an emphasis on quantitative risk solutions for capital markets. Next to Andre is Anup Ojah, who's a domain architect at Humana, where he leads a team working with highly available, large-scale distributed in-memory grid solutions to support high-performance, low-latency applications. Next, we've got Fintan, who's an industry analyst at RedMonk, where his research focuses on all things related to developers, from tooling and methodologies to organizational aspects of software development. And last but not least, Dunlap, who's a tech lead at Southwest Airlines, who's spent more than 15 years. He's got more than 15 years of experience in domains including crew scheduling, passenger reservation systems, flight operations, and optimization. So please welcome our panel. So to kick things off, as I mentioned at the top, and we've certainly talked about, and I think everyone's aware of, we're in this age of big and fast data. We've got, thanks to technologies like Hadoop, we can store more data than ever before. Pretty much for any large enterprise, it's economically feasible to pretty much store all your data. Meanwhile, we've got data that's streaming into systems at a rapid pace and only getting more rapid. Now, before we kind of get into some of the technical and architectural aspects of building these types of data-intensive applications, I'd love to get each of your perspectives on how traditionally developers think about data, and do they not need to start thinking about it a little bit differently in this age of big and fast data? Andre, why don't you kick things off?
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? I didn't have a band in high school, so I'm not very good at holding a mic and talking here. I think big data is interesting. In the banking business, a lot of applications have been built to products and silos, and they're very transactional in nature. It's really all about completing some particular action. What big data has given us is a realization that we can look at customers more holistically. So you hear a lot about customer journey and customer 360. I think a 360 is being 180 degrees of the same old transactions, but 180 degrees of how we interact with customers. It's dawned on us, amazingly, that when people call your call center, they might have looked at your website just beforehand and they're reacting to it. From a customer's perspective, that is all one continuous conversation. As an application developer, where in the past you had to think, hey, I'm going to get my transaction done, I'm going to be fault tolerant, you have to think now about what's the overall context that I'm operating in. Is the customer mad at me when they try to use my application? Is the customer delighted? If I can't do what they're asking, how do I continue the conversation across? So I think context, and I think that was actually part of the abstract, but context for an application developer is different. You have to think of yourself now as part of an application rather than as just simply a transactional widget.
Yep, thanks. Hi, Anup. So thanks for perspective. So I just want to give an example. So what we have done at Humana. So we started with a guiding principle. Our guiding principle is to make our member healthier by 20% by 2020. And think about it. So we have been getting all this big data, storing the data. Now, how to get an insight into the data and how I can make my member healthy. So as a developer, I think it's important to understand what you can do with all the data that you have been storing in your big data farm or your data lake. So you have to make perspective. You have to get insights into the data. So I believe as a developer, you have to understand a little bit more now. And I think there are a lot of tools that will help you to understand. So it's time to put your hat like a data scientist, data analyst, and go from there.
Mm-hmm. And Fintan, I know we've talked a little bit about how developers think about data or maybe don't think about data.
Yeah, so I'll be coming with a slightly different perspective. Our firm spends a lot of its time looking at how developers work, how they interact with the ecosystems, and what are the tools and trends and things that they're using. So we spent time talking with developers about how they're developing their applications at the moment. There's a couple of interesting changes that are occurring. One is an awareness of data, whereas previously people would have had a small set of test data and that's what they developed against and they did a feature. They're now trying to, again, understand, like the word context keeps coming up, understand the context of how the data is being used and approach problems in that kind of that manner. And a lot of that actually comes back down to what the user experience is in terms of how we're presenting data and how people are interacting with it. And that's quite a mindset shift from just producing a feature that produced a specific data point, rather to try bring in context and bring different things together.
I think a huge shift is data in motion requires a new set of verbs. So the traditional developer mindset of select and update and delete, those are your 3 big verbs. Data in motion requires things like, here's map as a new verb. How can I work on things in parallel to process a very fast event stream? So I think streaming data is certainly a huge trend, and a set of verbs that complement that are important. Another huge verb would be enrich. So, when we change information, how do I pull together information from other sources to create these very rich views? I think another big shift is giving data a voice and moving to a very event-driven point of view. A very asynchronous mindset is important, and our ability to express how things change as immutable messages is a very important shift in development thinking.
Great. So let's kind of dig in that a little bit more in terms of how you think about data from a application developer perspective. Because now you've got huge volumes of data at your disposal. You've got, if you throw enough resources and data scientists at a problem, they can pretty much come up with the answer to any question you want. How, as a developer, do you think about, well, what information do I want to surface in my applications? It's actually going to serve their interests. It's actually going to bring value to their experience. Who wants to chime in first?
So the question was, how does the developer build a software that is very specific to your applications? I think that's what it is, right? We have been talking about in context of an app. So you need to start thinking, when you build some kind of an app, the data has to deliver the message that the moment of truth, the user who is holding the app, he gets a moment of truth, he understands why the data was shown to him, and that's been utilized well. So that's one of the ways. Yeah.
I think one of the things that people miss in big data is that there's so much more signal that you've captured, but there's also exponentially more noise. I mean, one of the traps with machine learning is that it can produce amazing insights for you, like margarine consumption causes divorce, which I think I saw in one of Forrester's slide decks last year. It was intended to be a joke to show how machine learning run wild can get away from you. But I think the problem remains, how do you extract that signal? And I'm not sure that that's gotten better, to be honest, as a result of the leap forward in technology. I think it's gotten harder.
So yeah, on that exact point, it's asking the right question of the data is generally the key thing, and that is something where developers particularly need to spend a bit more time getting the domain expertise, and people are doing that. There's always been a traditional idea that developers would take a spec and it's thrown over the wall to them, and then they'll come back and blah blah. As we move to, and particularly like what we're talking about here at this conference, the very agile methods of development and trying to get people engaged and working with domain experts and kind of going backwards and forwards in quick iterative cycles, developing the right question becomes a lot easier and becomes a lot more feasible to do. There is a dangerous side effect of that, though, as well, is that developers as a whole have a habit of bike shedding on things, so they will spend ages on the wrong, very very specific thing that's very nice and very easy to do, rather than actually asking about that wider question. So ensuring the feedback loops are there is a very, very important thing.
Developers are experts on their side of the street, and when you have a requirement to integrate something from another source that you're not as familiar with, I think there's a real need for us improving our process. So we use Scrum at Southwest, and so we have defined roles and a defined product backlog, and it can be challenging for us to work with other teams to set priorities for their long list of things to do too. And that has been a challenge for us. So I think the other important thing is just how well we communicate with other teams to not only get work prioritized when we need to integrate messages from other domains, but also to understand their side of the street as well.
Let me add something. Fintan, your comment about moving to Agile kind of rings a bell. In banking, of course, we're the grand wizards of waterfall everything. And the way that we've done data historically has snapped into that very nicely. I mean, we have an anointed subject expert who creates a super authoritative view in some super heavyweight database, and nobody ever challenges it. And it is fairly authoritative, and it's got some signal and no noise. And the problem is that it's small. It's a masterpiece of a little world. In order to really make use of the added data that we're capturing now, we have to move to a more scientific type of approach. Experiment, fail, try again. Experiment, fail, try again. That's Agile. I know that banking is especially terrible at Agile, but I'm betting that there's a lot of other industries that aren't exactly great either. And I think the real challenge is figuring out how do you move to a scientific method approach to understanding data from a much more classic authoritative approach. I'm not sure that ties to app development, but I think that is really the crux of the problem.
So can you give us some example, like in your bank, you have a Scrum team. Do you also have a Scrum team that manages your backlog for your big data? And I know maybe a Scrum team for the app development. How about the people behind the doors, or who are on the DBA sides? How they work?
You know what? That's a great question. I'm laughing because I'm sure I've got at least 1,000 really good war stories about failures to adopt Agile in banking. I've personally sponsored quite a few of them. I'm sure it's not just me, although if it is, please everybody nod knowingly.
We're amongst friends here, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's nobody here that I work with. But I think one of the real problems is cultural. Things, if you look at, we were talking about this the other day, we're all nodding, big data, there's nobody that's just okay at big data. There are these runaway, spectacular winners that everybody wants to emulate. And then there's a whole pile of wannabes and also-rans that are kind of sitting at the starting gate going, why am I not one of the winners? And I think it really comes down to culture. And the same reason that you can't adopt Agile is also the reason why you're not going to succeed with big data. I think they're a pair, to be really clear. But
yeah, I mean, I would just add to that. I mean, we're talking about building applications that are surfacing insights based on a lot of machine learning and advanced data science, but the reality is in a lot of organizations, they're not there yet on the data side either. You're dealing with legacy approaches to data management, data warehousing, and you've also got a development team trying to transition to Agile, which can lead to a lot of challenges, clearly.
Yeah. I think too, just to throw in one more thing, one of the reasons that projects not necessarily with data succeed with Agile is that you get the cross-functional team. As a cynical old IT manager, I know that the fastest way to reduce the blame storm is to make sure the business participated in the whole project. On a positive front, though, that also is what gets you, communication, it's what gets you agility, it's what gets you innovation. I think you can't succeed at big data without that tight interweave, and the partnership is what does it.
Yeah, I would love for you guys to talk a little bit more about the implications to building software development teams and that the need to collaborate across both with business domain experts as well as your data and analytics teams.
Yeah. So just this actually relates directly into that. When we're talking about the cross-functional teams and the blame storms, the freedom to fail and the allowing people to fail is a cultural change in organizations that's really, really, really hard. And it doesn't matter how much people say that stop, oh no, we're okay with people failing. There will be a whole layer of people that will go, I need to pass the blame around everywhere. And that's something, again, when we're talking about it from a developer perspective, they're looking at going, I'm going to be the end person who's going to get blamed for this going wrong. And until they have the freedom to actually make a mistake, there's always going to be some problem with how they'll address and deal with the application development.
Assumptions are really bad in software development. And often, like I'll use our team as an example, we see all of these integrated data sets day in, day out, right? So we assume that our customers feel that and know that the same way we would. So it's very important to remember someone who isn't used to having information at their fingertips from other domains may not be thinking, well, let me ask for different ways to take advantage of that. So it's back to the communication need of making sure it's a two-way street and not just being on the receiving end of that and taking advantage of POCs and a show-me type mentality to really embrace what we have available at our fingertips.
So, all right, let's talk a little bit about kind of a little bit more of the technology and kind of the data approaches to data management that we typically see, and how that impacts how you're developing applications. So, in that traditional world of data, you've got this. Oftentimes you've got a single data model, kind of to rule them all. But we're hearing at this conference, of course, a lot about building applications using microservices, where in some cases you're going to have different data models for different services. It would seem there's a conflict there. I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit about kind of that conflict and how you might go about resolving it.
So again, I come from a very traditional company, so we have a big SOA presence, and we think SOA is not dead. SOA is going to be here forever, But at the same time, there's this huge notion of microservice coming up. So what we have done in our company is we have tried to divide our services into kind of different kind of appeals. So we have something like a local appeal. Makes sense. You make a microservice. We have a domain appeal. A domain is like a line of business. That's fine. So your domain has a domain object. So you reside within that object. That's how you build a domain appeal services. Now let's talk about an enterprise service. An enterprise service is a mixture of many, many domains. So I'll take an example of a member business entity. So what it does, it gives us member demographics, coverages, groups, policies, a lot of stuff comes in. So I have a very big domain. So now how do you break up that domain? And if I'm building an app, somebody says, hey, I just want to know my member ID. Do you want to give him the whole domain? No, right? So we have come up with some patterns. So one pattern that we use is called an API facade pattern. So what we do with the pattern is we build APIs on top of our SOA services. That's how I say it. So that's how we still have our SOA running behind the scene. At the same time, we are building an API facade, and we are building microservices on top of it to give what the app is looking for.
So I think, in banking, the governance is a bit of a special case. We're an extremely highly regulated industry, and we enjoy the public's trust, and so we have to respect that through caring for data. A lot of what happens in banking is really regulatory driven, complying with the privacy legislation in GBLA or PIPEDA if you're a Canadian like me. Meeting BCBS 239's regulations for regulatory reporting, which are just dreadfully prescriptive. They all have in common that they're trying to generate confidence in the handling of data. And I think that's something that is almost opposing the want to use data more freely in data science. I often actually sort of wistfully look out from my bag tower and think, if I worked at an airline or a consumer products company, I'll bet you this would be easier. I'm hoping it is, so maybe I'll...
I think we all feel pain, but just in different ways. That's what's nice, I've really enjoyed these conversations and the opportunity to meet people from many different industries. Our experience has been, here's a long list of systems that are old are getting long in the tooth, and we need to move faster, going from old to new. And on the system that we're working on that's new, we didn't start out to build a monolith. But after a year or two on that, we were at a point where we needed to take something that was too big and split it into something smaller. And so I think an important expectation is that you won't define boundaries perfectly from the very beginning, but the key is to position yourself well with your software patterns so that you're not trapped. And that's why I'm so excited, I'll say passionate. Yeah, that's a strong word about getting your software patterns right. And these architectures that will hold water for the next 10 years of growth are very different. I'll speed tell this story. we had a vendor, and I made the point, well, we're taking, small incremental steps. Like, that's a very popular thought, don't boil the ocean. And the vendor said, well, let me push back on you. And he was very nice about it, and he said, sometimes you need to make a radical shift, otherwise you fall back into the familiar ways. And I thought that was an interesting point that he made, in that a lot of these things require us to be very bold with making a shift, not only to cloud native or platform thinking, but also with patterns that are new.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear the rest of the panelists respond to that. I mean, do you agree with that approach and that idea that you really need to make bold steps? And particularly in an industry like banking, where you're highly regulated, maybe that's not always the first thought when adopting new approaches.
Do you want let me, since you sort of called my name there, I'm probably the only person you're going to get here that'll admit to being a banker. I think, those radical steps are important, but I think you can achieve them through, small, enlightened, innovative incrementalism. And I'm not, it's a classic to say, oh, let's make this 3% better or 5% better, which I suppose is okay, but that's what all the companies that are out of business were doing when they went out of business. I think we talked a little bit about how your giant one data model project is guaranteed to fail because you can't possibly amass that much expertise and information in a reasonable amount of time. The reason I think microservices work in our space is that you don't have to master a lot to generate something effective. And that's what really gets you that drive to progress, much more so than the big projects.
So just going back to your question was, at Humana, we believe, like I come from the enterprise architecture team, so we believe in reference architecture, and we always try to build a roadmap. So it's very important to understand that it's good to talk about microservices, but also good to understand how you can get into the journey of microservices. You cannot just straight away take away all your old SOA services and start building microservices, right? So we build a lot of reference architecture, and we implement that. We do a lot of POCs, POTs, try to understand what it takes to do something. And we have a streamline called tech adoption. So we try to adopt technology. At the same time, we draw a roadmap. We just don't put something there and start working on it. So it's very important to have your patterns right. I think, as I said, we have some patterns built in. You have to implement in the right way. And I think that will take you to the long journey of getting the microservices.
Yeah, I think the patterns part of it is that is absolutely key, and it's particularly one of the problems with cloud native when you talk to a lot of people about it is this idea that, I won't say that there is nothing else, that there is no legacy, but people try to go, well, we'll just work on net new and we don't think about the legacy. And so like the airline system, I don't know if you guys actually use this, but like a huge amount of bookings go through, I think, Sabre at the back end, which is ultimately a mainframe, and that's not going away. It's just it's there forever. And it's similarly in banking, there's core systems that are just there, and you're always going to have to deal with them. So that getting the patterns right and understanding things like the API facade that you're talking about there, and various other patterns, like I think Matt Steen from Pivotal has written a really interesting book where he's got some very, very nice pieces inside there where he talks about some of the patterns for dealing with all of this kind of stuff, and that's really, really key.
Well, kind of picking up on that, so you've got these systems that you're going to have to deal with. They're not going away. So when you're building these applications, we've talked about all these different sources of data that's streaming in different velocities. So now your application is dependent to some extent on those external sources of data. So I wonder if each of you could weigh in a little bit about how you approach kind of performance and availability when you've got external sources that are going to impact your ability to actually deliver value through that application. If a data source goes down, for example, that's key to your application, how do you handle that?
So I'll give a really quick answer as the analyst. I get to draw a little PowerPoint diagram and say this will all work, and then hand it over to someone else.
So I will give you a more technical answer for that. So performance is key, right? So we started, and then Mike Stolz, I see him in front of us. So 2 years back, when we started this journey again, from SOA to get very fast applications running. So we had a team called High Performance Low Latency. So we did a lot of research, and we went to Gartner, and then they recommended us something called in-memory data grid. And that's how we got Gemfire into Humana. And thanks to Pivotal for that, for giving us Gemfire.
We didn't pay him to say that.
Yes, so that's really helping us to speed what we need from our apps. As I said, our API facade patterns runs on SOA, right behind the scene. But now what we have done, all the data that was on all these mainframe systems, we bring this data to Gemfire. So we have pretty big clusters running. Those are our clusters that we do a lot of reads out of it, and that's how we are achieving performance. And that's how I think I can answer you.
Great.
Yeah, it's. I think in banking, of course, people want reliability, and so we put an enormous amount of effort into making sure nothing ever goes down. And as application developers, generally we tell people, don't try to implement, nothing will ever go down in your application. Assume that the container it's in will never go down. What I need from you as a developer is I need you to think about how fast can I recover and how can I seamlessly handle failure in my container. That's a very different problem, and I think it's one that you can actually act on as a developer. I have a joke here. For a bank, if we lose our data center, for us, that's equivalent to being teleported back to 1960. We just break out the paper and pencils and do everything that way. There really is no halfway state anymore.
Performance thinking is a mentality. And when you have these conversations around, well, how fast does it need to go? You can start with how slow can it be and we can get away with it versus how fast can I make it? And I'm very much with, well, we need patterns that help us scale and recover as soon as possible. And that's definitely a very different mentality, not just 10x, maybe 100x, maybe 1,000x, what your normal performance throughput rate might be. So you really need to aggressively look at patterns that help you scale throughput. And all of those performance conversations are tricky.
So I'll just give an example of a pattern. So I know that there are a lot of developers here. So circuit breaker pattern, that's really a pattern that you have to look at it. So you asked about if I have two data center, and then even though I have Gemfire running, if one goes down, what do we do? So we have implemented circuit breaker pattern a lot, and that's really helping us. So the circuit breaks, it understands that this data center or this service is not working, it trips to the other one. That's how I'm giving 100% availability of my data. So that's something to take back home, think about this pattern called circuit breaker. It's really awesome.
So just very quickly on that kind of point, there was an awful lot of stuff with the various patterns, but there's a thing of looking at what's already been done, and this is what's quite interesting when you look at, say, like all the Netflix stuff being repackaged and this kind of stuff. Look at what people have done, stand on the shoulders of giants. And one of the things that we've noticed over the last year has been, or kind of over the last 2 or 3 years, has been a resurgence in interest in looking at academic research and then applying it into distributed systems. And it's been absolutely fascinating and wonderful to watch. But if you look at things like the papers we love, meetup groups and things like that, and see what people are talking about, there's loads of stuff there that people get to learn. And that's changing how developers are thinking about approaching problems quite rapidly, I think.
Let me just to play on this too. I think the recoverability and performance management are really sides of the same coin. My overnight market risk run that I do to calculate the capital for our bank throws off 1.5 billion rows of data, and it runs in 3 hours. So naturally, everything downstream is very highly adapted to handling this tidal wave of stuff. If I were to try to recover that and turn the crank up to, say, 1 hour, could your downstream process handle that? That's really the same question as I would like to just run this in an hour as normal course. So I think as developers, you need to think through, why can't I run this 10 times faster?
Right.
And it's very handy in recovery when you're panicking to catch up.
Great. So I know we're very close on time. In fact, we might be a minute over. I wonder if we have 2 minutes. Any audience questions for our panelists? Don't be shy. If not, I can come up with the last question. Sure, we got one.
What about the security of the data?
So the question was, what about security and securing data in these types of applications? Who wants to
I
weigh
would tell
in?
you something you probably already know, so I'd be interested to hear what Southwest has to say about that.
We have many of the similar regulations I think other people do with PCI and SOX compliance. So I think it's, yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, I've got to ask. I didn't realize Airlines had to be SOX compliant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No way.
Yep.
Okay, this is totally worth it.
See,
Yeah.
not only are you learning things, our panelists are learning new things as well.
Yeah,
It's
I
a
mean,
win-win.
I know we're short on time. I think a lot of it is just, it's a quick conversation on that, and that there's really only one right answer, which is yes, we're compliant, and here's how. And that's somewhat unique to every industry around how they've gotten the green check mark for that. But
Right,
just,
great.
I mean, to know that it's something that, you don't do once. It's a continuous thing.
Great. Well, guys, thanks. I know we could continue talking about this for hours, but I think that wouldn't be. I'm getting some looks from the back of the room. So why don't we wrap this up, guys? Thank you so much for taking the time, joining us on the panel. Thanks for you to join us. I think some of these guys just can stick around if you want to ask some questions afterwards. Feel free. And
Yeah, there's at least a couple of you have sessions coming later.
right, good point. So feel free to come chat with
Yes.
these guys. And thanks again.